Hollywood was built with light. But light disappears quickly. Under the California sun, these houses still stand, not abandoned, not collapsing, just silent. Silent in the way places become after power has passed through them. Fame, control, and egos too large to be carried away when the people leave. Hollywood can rewrite history. Headlines can change. Legends can be polished or erased. But walls do not forget. Hallways do not forget. Rooms where doors were closed after parties ended. Nights without sleep. Decisions never meant for the public eye. All of it is still there. And that is what makes this unsettling. The people who reached the highest peaks of fame often left behind the quietest spaces. This film is not about Hollywood on screen. It is about Hollywood after the lights go out. We will walk through a series of houses, each one tied to a single life, and together they form a map of a dream in decline. A place where fame leaves quickly, but consequences linger far longer. If the walls of Hollywood's houses could speak, what would be the first story they tell? Stay with us, and subscribe if you want to step inside the spaces Hollywood never wanted you to see. Falcon Lair and the Death of the First Global Idol. The 1910s to 1926. Hollywood was still young, but the world was already ready for an idol. In 1913, a young Italian man arrived in America. His birth name was Rodolfo Guglielmi. No money, no connections, no fluent English. He began in New York, then drifted west, toward a new industry taking shape among rough studios and California sunlight. In the early years, he survived on odd jobs: a hired dancer, a stand-in, nameless background roles. Hollywood had no concept of stardom yet. Faces were interchangeable. That began to change in the early 1920s. Silent film entered its explosive phase. Cameras no longer needed voices, only faces. And Valentino's face offered something Hollywood had never seen. He did not resemble the American men of the era. Not rugged, not rigid. Long gazes, fluid gestures. A foreign kind of allure. In 1921, The Sheik was released. Within weeks, Valentino became a global symbol of romance. Not because of complex acting, but because he embodied a collective fantasy. The man women were finally allowed to desire. Millions of letters poured into the studios. His name appeared in newspapers across Europe, Latin America, the Middle East. Hollywood realized something new. Public love could be manufactured at scale. By 1925, Valentino was among the highest-paid actors in Hollywood. His annual income would equal several $1,000,000 today. And at that peak, he began building Falcon Lair. The house sat above Whitley Heights, a Mediterranean-style villa overlooking the city. Falcon Lair was not meant as a refuge. It was designed as a symbol. Valentino wanted distance from the crowds, but height enough to remind the world he had risen above it. Yet Falcon Lair was never fully completed. Several sections remained unfinished. Some rooms were never used. A house built for the future, while its owner's body was already paying the price for the present. Valentino worked relentlessly, endless shooting schedules, an image that did not allow fatigue, aging, or weakness. Hollywood needed an idol, not a human being. In August 1926, Valentino was hospitalized in New York with severe abdominal pain. The initial diagnosis was unclear. Within days, complications followed. He died at the age of 31. The news spread globally within hours. Thousands gathered outside the hospital. Hundreds of thousands lined the streets during the funeral. Women fainted. Reports of copycat suicides followed, though the true scale remains debated. Hollywood witnessed something unprecedented. Public love did not stop at mourning. It turned into hysteria. Pola Negri, Valentino's co-star and romantic companion, appeared at the funeral. She cried, collapsed, and was carried away before the press cameras. Afterward, she placed flowers at Falcon Lair every week. The ritual continued for years, recorded by newspapers as an emblem of undying love. But Falcon Lair remained empty. No music, no parties, no future unfolding. A house built to live inside tomorrow became a marker of a life that ended too soon. Here, Hollywood learned its first lesson about power. Public love does not always save its idols. Sometimes, it is what destroys them. Falcon Lair still stands beneath the California sun, a silent trace of the moment Hollywood understood that fame is not only created, but can also annihilate. If the love of the entire world could not keep one man alive, then what is fame truly offering? A reward, or the price paid for being seen too completely? Marion Davies Beach House and the Power Behind the Spotlight, 1926 to 1951. Hollywood entered a different phase. After Valentino's death, the industry no longer ran on public emotion alone. It began to run on power. At the center of that shift stood one woman. Her name was Marion Davies. Marion Davies was born in 1897 in Brooklyn, New York. She came from a performing arts background, trained on stage, with a natural talent for comedy, a rare skill in the silent film era. In the early years of her career, she was not shaped as a romantic icon, but as a technically capable actress. Everything changed when Marion Davies entered a relationship with William Randolph Hearst. Hearst was not a Hollywood insider. He was the most powerful media tycoon in America at the time, controlling dozens of newspapers, magazines, and radio outlets. A man capable of creating or destroying public image with a single headline. From that moment on, Hollywood witnessed a new kind of power. No longer the spontaneous affection of the audience, but backstage influence with the ability to control narrative. In 1926, the same year Valentino died, Hearst commissioned the construction of the Marion Davies Beach House in Santa Monica, a vast seaside estate spanning more than 10 hectares with a private beach, saltwater pool, screening rooms, grand ballrooms, and facilities built for large-scale hosting. Adjusted for modern value, the land and construction would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. This house was not built to live in. It was built to host power. The gatherings held there quickly became Hollywood's unofficial center of influence. Actors, directors, politicians, financiers. Anyone who wanted to remain relevant in the ecosystem had to pass through this space. Marion Davies was the hostess, and she was also the most closely watched person in the room. She had talent, but that talent was gradually overshadowed by another story. That her success came not from ability, but from Hearst's power. Whispers began to circulate. Some articles implied, others openly mocked. Hollywood did not attack directly. It eroded reputation through assumption. Here, a core conflict emerged. Power gave Marion Davies everything, and yet it made nothing she achieved fully believable. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Marion continued to work steadily. Box office numbers remained solid, but her public image was never separated from Hearst. Then the power began to crack. By the late 1930s, the Hearst empire was in serious decline. Operating costs soared. Debt accumulated. Political influence faded. Newspapers that once shaped public opinion were sold off piece by piece. As media power collapsed, Hollywood did not wait. The parties thinned out. Guests stopped coming. Phones rang less often. Marion Davies' beach house entered its period of silence. No longer a center of influence. No longer a backstage stage. Just a space too large for one life. After Hearst's death in 1951, Marion Davies withdrew completely from Hollywood. The beachfront estate lost its purpose. For years, it stood neglected, deteriorating, nearly forgotten. Eventually, the property was restored and converted into a public space. Rooms that once held power were opened to everyone. Beaches once reserved for the elite became shared ground. But the trace remained. Not in the walls, but in the lesson Hollywood absorbed. After Valentino, Hollywood learned that public love could destroy its idols. After Marion Davies, Hollywood learned something else. Power could protect an image, but it could not erase judgment. Marion Davies' beach house stands along the Pacific coast. Unlike Falcon Lair, it does not mark a death. It marks a transition, from emotion to image control. If power can invite the entire world into a house, yet still fail to protect one person from being judged, then what truly decides the fate of Hollywood's icons? Pickfair and the Collapse of Hollywood's Fairy Tale, 1920 to 1936. Hollywood no longer wanted to create stars alone. Hollywood wanted to create royalty. At the center of that dream stood two names known across America: Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks. Mary Pickford was born in 1892 in Toronto, Canada. She stepped onto the stage as a child, spending her early years moving through touring theaters and cramped film sets. By the 1910s, Pickford had become the most recognizable face in American silent cinema. Audiences called her America's sweetheart. Not because of power, but because she represented safety, innocence, and emotional reassurance. Douglas Fairbanks was born in 1883 in Denver, Colorado. He arrived in Hollywood from the stage, carrying an entirely different image. Energetic, physical, in constant motion. Fairbanks embodied the ideal American hero of the silent era, a man of action before voices mattered. When these two icons came together, Hollywood saw an opportunity it had never encountered before. Not merely a romance, a dynasty. In 1920, Pickford and Fairbanks married. That same year, they purchased and transformed a large property in Beverly Hills. It soon became known as Pickfair. Pickfair was not simply a residence. It was designed as a palace. Spanning more than 3 hectares with a Tudor-style main house, landscaped gardens, a private library, and an in-house screening room. Adjusted for modern value, the estate and renovations would amount to hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet Pickfair's true power was not architectural. It lay in what happened inside. Pickfair quickly became the White House of Hollywood. Its gatherings were historic. Heads of state, industrialists, movie stars, writers, global elites. To be invited to Pickfair was to be officially recognized as part of Hollywood itself. Here, Hollywood was no longer merely an entertainment industry. It crowned itself. Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks were no longer just actors. They were the living symbols of a perfectly staged fairy tale. Love, power, public devotion. But at the very moment the fairy tale reached its most flawless form, cracks began to appear. By the late 1920s, silent film was in decline. The arrival of sound transformed the industry completely. Voice, timing, and adaptability became matters of survival. Douglas Fairbanks struggled with the transition. His exaggerated physical style no longer fit the new medium. Mary Pickford attempted to adapt, even cutting off her iconic curls. But the image of America's sweetheart could not be reshaped easily. Hollywood, once eager to elevate, began to turn away. At the same time, their marriage entered crisis. Life at Pickfair ceased to be a stage for grand celebrations. Silence filled the corridors. Separate schedules. Rooms no longer shared. In 1936, Pickford and Fairbanks officially divorced. The fairy tale ended not with spectacle, but with a quiet separation. Douglas Fairbanks left Pickfair. He remarried, but his influence never returned to its former height. Mary Pickford remained. Pickfair was no longer a palace. It became a space too large for one person. Pickford continued to live there for years, increasingly withdrawn, avoiding public life. Hollywood had moved on. New faces, new voices. The old fairy tale was no longer retold. Eventually, Pickfair was demolished. Not because it was beyond repair, but because the symbol it represented was no longer needed. A castle built for love outlived the love itself. And with Pickfair, an era of Hollywood came to an end. A time when the industry believed it could crown itself and rule as royalty. When the fairy tale collapses, those who once lived inside it must learn how to exist in a Hollywood that no longer needs them. So when the dream ends, how do the ones left behind go on living? Chateau Marmont, and the place where Hollywood hides from itself. 1929 to the present. Hollywood entered an age of instability. A dream newly constructed was forced to confront the weight of reality. In 1929, on Sunset Boulevard, Chateau Marmont opened its doors. At first, it was not a sanctuary for the film industry. It was designed as a long-term residential hotel, inspired by European castles, with private kitchens and secluded balconies. The purpose was practical. A temporary home for people with money who did not want attention. Only months later, the stock market collapsed. The Great Depression spread. Hollywood pulled inward. Projects were canceled. Contracts frozen. Stars who once filled newspapers began to disappear from public space. Chateau Marmont shifted its role. From convenience to refuge. Its location mattered. Set back on a hillside, removed from the main flow of traffic. No large signage, no grand entrance. Chateau Marmont did not demand visibility. It allowed disappearance. By the 1930s, it began attracting people Hollywood did not know how to place. Stars avoiding the press. Directors seeking distance from the studio system. Figures with power who refused management. Greta Garbo came here to avoid being seen, famous for withdrawing from public life. She found in Chateau Marmont a place that asked no questions. Howard Hughes used the hotel as a temporary base. An industrialist, filmmaker, and man obsessed with control and privacy. Chateau Marmont allowed him to exist inside Hollywood without belonging to it. Jean Harlow also passed through during her peak years, a pre-code symbol of glamour. Between acclaim and scandal, Chateau Marmont became a buffer zone. No questions, no records, no interference. An unwritten rule formed. What happened at Chateau Marmont did not leave Chateau Marmont. That rule transformed the hotel into a rare space of freedom. freedom from studios, freedom from schedules, freedom from fixed identities. But freedom always has a cost. In the same corridors, creativity and scandal coexisted. Scripts written in silence, career-altering decisions made after midnight, and actions Hollywood preferred not to record also took place here. Not everything was confirmed. Some stories exist only as recollections, but Chateau Marmont neither denied nor verified. It functioned as a gray zone quietly accepted by the system. Across decades, as Hollywood shifted from silent film to sound, from studio dominance to personalized power, Chateau Marmont retained its role, a place owned by no one, yet always needed. The hotel carried no star's name. It belonged to no studio. It represented no dynasty. Its lack of ownership made it a shared refuge for those who wanted to step away from the light. Hollywood creates images. Chateau Marmont lets those images dissolve. And here, a quiet question takes shape. If the most famous people in the world keep returning to one place in order to disappear, what is it about Hollywood itself that makes them need to escape it? Jean Harlow and the House on Palm Avenue, 1932 to 1937. Hollywood entered a strange phase. Fame had grown powerful enough to create icons, but not mature enough to protect the human being inside them. At the center of this contradiction stood Jean Harlow. Jean Harlow was born in 1911 in Kansas City, Missouri. She did not come from a grand theatrical lineage or an established artistic family. Her rise to Hollywood was fast, almost abrupt. By the early 1930s, after only a handful of roles, Harlow became America's new symbol of glamour. The press called her the blonde bombshell. The label was repeated so often that it began to eclipse the person behind it. Harlow became famous very young. Fame arrived before she had time to form a private life of her own. Contrary to her on-screen image, Jean Harlow did not seek extravagance. She disliked endless parties. She avoided crowded spaces. Those close to her recalled a very simple desire: to live like an ordinary person. In 1932, Harlow moved into a modest house on Palm Avenue in Los Angeles. Not a showpiece mansion, no grand gates, no attention-seeking architecture. Palm Avenue did not represent power. It represented withdrawal. The house became Harlow's rare refuge, a place without cameras, without contracts, without an image to perform. There she cooked, hosted close friends, and briefly stepped outside the role Hollywood imposed on her. But inside that quiet space, something else was unfolding. By the mid-1930s, Jean Harlow's health began to decline. The symptoms appeared gradually: persistent fatigue, abdominal pain, physical weakness, signs vague enough to be ignored in an industry driven by speed and profit. Hollywood at the time had no mechanism for slowing production for a star's health. Filming schedules continued. Image maintenance remained a priority. Harlow's physical condition was concealed or dismissed as insufficiently serious to interrupt work. And this is where the story turns. In 1937, Jean Harlow's condition deteriorated rapidly. She was hospitalized in critical state. The final diagnosis involved acute kidney failure, possibly resulting from a prolonged, untreated infection. Some medical details remain debated, but the outcome does not. Jean Harlow died in June 1937. She was only 26 years old. Public reaction was seismic. Hollywood lost the defining icon of a generation. Newspapers filled with tributes. Crowds gathered outside funeral homes. A collective shock spread, not only because of her death, but because of how quickly it happened. Palm Avenue was no longer a refuge. It became a frozen memory. The house where Harlow only wanted to live as a human being was now bound to a question Hollywood had never prepared to answer. For the first time, the industry faced an issue that images could not conceal: its ethical responsibility toward the people behind fame. Jean Harlow did not die on a film set. She did not die in scandal. She died while trying to live an ordinary life. The house on Palm Avenue was never meant to be a symbol, yet it became a quiet warning that sometimes what a star needs most is not more light, but the right to be vulnerable. If someone is taken before they are allowed to live as themselves, what is it within Hollywood itself that steals their future? Garden of Allah and the Community of Genius and Failure, 1919 to 1959. Hollywood once had a place that did not demand victory, only existence. That place was known as the Garden of Allah. The story begins in 1919 on Sunset Boulevard. A large parcel of land was purchased by Alla Nazimova. Nazimova was a rare phenomenon in early Hollywood. Born in what is now Ukraine and trained rigorously in European theater, she arrived in America carrying an uncompromising artistic vision. At the time, Nazimova was among the highest-paid actresses in Hollywood. She used her wealth to build a lavish Spanish-style estate, radically different from the prevailing norms. This was not merely a residence. It was a declaration of creative independence. But Hollywood was not a place that easily absorbed difference ahead of its time. Nazimova's experimental projects failed commercially. Production costs were high. Returns were modest. Within a few years, her finances collapsed. And this is where the story turns. To survive, the estate was converted into a bungalow-style hotel. Each unit stood alone, private and understated. The Garden of Allah did not sell glamour. It sold acceptance. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the property became a gathering place for those no longer firmly positioned within Hollywood's official hierarchy. Writers, screenwriters, artists, people suspended between genius and failure. F. Scott Fitzgerald lived and wrote here during the final years of his life, when reputation no longer guaranteed stability. Dorothy Parker frequented the garden as an intellectual refuge, a place where no one required her to be charming. Greta Garbo appeared as well, not to be seen, but to be left alone. At the Garden of Allah, no one asked whether you were rising or falling. No contracts were inspected. No worth was measured by box office returns. Fragility was accepted as a normal state. That very quality made the place dangerous to a Hollywood that was changing. After the Second World War, the industry entered a period of restructuring. The new order favored efficiency, branding, and control. Spaces that could not be managed became liabilities. The Garden of Allah did not fit the new Hollywood. It produced no clearly defined product. It served no single brand. It represented no centralized power. By the late 1950s, a decision was made. The bungalow complex was demolished, a space that had held decades of creativity, crisis, and recovery was erased to make way for a modern commercial development. There was no memorial, no preservation effort, only complete disappearance. The Garden of Allah did not end because it decayed. It ended because it represented something Hollywood no longer wished to see: humanity. A place that once allowed people to exist without winning could not survive in a system that recognized only success. Hollywood kept the light, but it lost the place where darkness was allowed to breathe. And when an industry destroys the most human space it ever created, what remains for those no longer strong enough to shine, yet not ready to vanish? Twin Palms and the Crisis of Frank Sinatra, 1947 to 1953. Hollywood had learned how to create idols. It had not yet learned how to save them when everything collapsed. At the center of this period stood Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was born in 1915 in Hoboken, New Jersey. The son of Italian immigrant working-class parents, he entered music through his voice, not through power or connections. By the early 1940s, Sinatra had become a cultural phenomenon. Concert halls sold out. Records sold in the millions. His name defined a generation. But success that arrives too early carries equal pressure. After the Second World War, public taste began to shift. New voices emerged. The image of the teenage idol turned into a burden. Media attention no longer protected him. It scrutinized him. By the late 1940s, Sinatra's career began to unravel. Recording contracts were terminated. Performance schedules thinned. Health issues affected his voice, at times nearly silencing it. Pressure accumulated, no longer hidden behind applause. At the same time, his private life fractured. His marriage collapsed. Personal relationships became public spectacle. Hollywood was no longer watching a star struggle. It was watching a man become isolated. During this period, Sinatra retreated to Twin Palms in Palm Springs. The house, completed in 1947, was a modernist estate set apart from Hollywood's center. Twin Palms was not a symbol of power. It was an escape. There, Sinatra stepped away from the industrial rhythm. No sound stages, no recording booths, only desert space, silence, and a man forced to confront himself. But Twin Palms did not erase the crisis, it exposed it. The early 1950s marked the lowest point of Sinatra's career. He was considered outdated. Studios lost interest. Record labels hesitated. The fame he once commanded became distant memory. And this is where the story turns. In 1953, Sinatra accepted a supporting role in From Here to Eternity. The role offered no star image. It portrayed a wounded, conflicted, imperfect soldier. The performance earned him the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. That moment did more than revive his career. It redefined Frank Sinatra. No longer a fixed idol, but an artist capable of depth, failure, and renewal. During this period, Twin Palms ceased to be merely a refuge. It became a transitional space, a place where a man fell far enough to rebuild himself. Hollywood often tells success as a straight upward line. Twin Palms witnessed a different curve. Collapse, silence, return. Some houses do more than record moments of glory. They hold the moment when a person stands alone, with no spotlight left to lean on. So when fame disappears, and only a stripped-bare human being remains, what determines whether that moment is an ending or a beginning? Greystone Mansion and the Moment Money Failed Against Fate, 1928 to 1929. Hollywood once believed money could buy anything, until Greystone proved otherwise. The story begins with Edward L. Doheny. Doheny was one of the most powerful oil magnates in early 20th century America. Born into poverty, he built his fortune through oil fields in California and Mexico, becoming a living symbol of the industrial era's version of the American dream. By the late 1920s, Doheny's wealth was estimated at the equivalent of billions of dollars today. Money brought political influence, access, and a sense of invulnerability. To mark that status, Doheny commissioned the construction of Greystone Mansion in Beverly Hills. Completed in 1928, the estate spanned more than 4,000 square meters, with 55 rooms, Tudor Revival architecture, and a commanding view over the city. Construction costs at the time reached approximately $4 million. Adjusted for modern value, that figure exceeds $70 to $80 million. Greystone was not built as a home. It was built as a fortress, a statement that financial power could create absolute safety. The intended resident was not Doheny himself, but his son, Edward L. Doheny Jr., and his family. But even as the mansion was completed, a shadow was already forming. At the same time, the United States was shaken by the Teapot Dome scandal, one of the largest corruption scandals in American history. It involved the illegal leasing of federal oil reserves. Edward L. Doheny stood at the center of the controversy. He was accused of bribing the Secretary of the Interior in exchange for drilling rights. Public hearings followed. The press descended. The family's reputation began to fracture. Money was no longer enough to provide cover. Then the tragedy occurred. In February 1929, only months after the family moved into Greystone, Edward Doheny Jr. and his close associate Hugh Plunkett were found dead inside one of the mansion's rooms. Plunkett had been shot. Doheny Jr. had also died from gunfire. A pistol was discovered at the scene. Police moved quickly to issue a conclusion. They ruled it a murder-suicide. Plunkett had killed Doheny Jr. and then taken his own life. But the story did not end there. Too many details failed to align. The positioning of the bodies, the timing of death, the unclear motive, and the broader legal pressure created by the Teapot Dome investigation. The Doheny family rejected the official explanation. Public skepticism grew. Newspapers raised questions. Some theories suggested a deliberate cover-up. Others believed the political scandal created pressures that spiraled beyond control. No single explanation has ever achieved full public consensus. And Greystone, instead of becoming a symbol of security, became the center of an unresolved mystery. Within a single year, a mansion built with vast wealth was permanently associated with death, suspicion, and reputational collapse. The family left. No one remained. Greystone fell silent. Hollywood confronted something it had long avoided acknowledging. Financial power can build thick walls, but it cannot purchase absolute safety. It cannot control fate. Greystone Mansion still stands, magnificent, cold, and silent. A reminder that when money reaches its peak, it ceases to be a shield and becomes a backdrop for tragedy. So when everything that can be bought has already been bought, and disaster still strikes, what within human power itself is the greatest illusion of all? The Pink Palace and the Branding of Jane Mansfield, 1956 to 1967. Hollywood entered a new era. Fame was no longer created only on screen. It was designed, packaged, and sold as a brand. At the center of this shift stood Jane Mansfield. Jane Mansfield was born in 1933 in Pennsylvania. Contrary to her public image, she possessed a serious academic background, spoke multiple languages, and had formal training in music and performance. Hollywood, however, had little use for that depth. It wanted a new bombshell for the post-Marilyn Monroe era. By the mid-1950s, Mansfield was shaped into a carefully constructed symbol. Blonde hair, exaggerated curves, calculated provocation. The media did not simply report on her, it helped manufacture her. And Jane Mansfield understood this. In 1956, Mansfield and her husband at the time built the Pink Palace in Los Angeles. The mansion was painted pink inside and out, lavish, excessive, deliberately opposed to the restrained elegance of old Hollywood. The Pink Palace was not a home in the traditional sense. It was a declaration, an extension of the Jane Mansfield brand. The house quickly became a hub for parties and publicity. Reporters were invited. Photographs were staged. Every detail served the maintenance of a public image. During this period, Mansfield did not merely live within fame. She operated it. But that very strategy carried an unavoidable contradiction. When image becomes everything, there is no room left for transformation. Hollywood began to tire of the product it had once aggressively promoted. By the late 1950s, Mansfield's film career stalled. Roles repeated themselves. Major projects grew scarce. Media attention continued, but it no longer sustained her professionally. Fame persisted, but substance quietly drained away. And this is where the story turns. Mansfield increasingly appeared in tabloid headlines rather than artistic work. Her private life became spectacle. Attempts to reshape her image met little support from the industry. The Pink Palace, once a stage for visual power, gradually became a financial and psychological burden. The house was too large for a brand losing momentum. In 1967, tragedy struck. Jane Mansfield was killed in a devastating automobile accident in Louisiana. She was 34 years old. The shock was profound, not only because of the accident, but because of the brutal contrast between the manufactured image and the reality of her ending. Shortly afterward, the Pink Palace was demolished. No preservation, no conversion. The house vanished from the Hollywood landscape. Its destruction was not about architecture. It was about symbolism. The meaning it carried no longer fit the era. The Pink Palace had once stood as a monument to fame engineered as permanence. But when the person behind the image disappeared, the house lost its reason to exist. Hollywood learned a late lesson. Image can create power, but it cannot save the person trapped inside it. So when fame is built as a brand, with no space left for real life, what remains? When the stage collapses and the lights finally go out. Norma Shearer and the Power of a Controlled Exit, 1920 to 1937. Hollywood is accustomed to telling stories of collapse, but sometimes true power lies in knowing when to leave. At the center of this chapter stands Norma Shearer. Norma Shearer was born in 1902 in Canada. She entered Hollywood not through scandal or spectacle, but through discipline, clear ambition, and meticulous preparation for every role. By the early 1920s, Shearer had become one of MGM's leading actresses. Yet her influence extended beyond the screen. It was defined by her partnership with Irving Thalberg, the most powerful production executive in Hollywood at the time. Thalberg was not only Shearer's husband, he was the architect of the modern studio system, the man who controlled scripts, schedules, star images, and careers. Together, they formed a quiet center of power. Their home was not a site of extravagant parties, not a stage for publicity. It was a working space, a place where roles were prepared as long-term strategy. Shearer became known for her methodical approach to performance. She studied characters in depth, costume, physicality, psychology. She avoided scandal. She did not rely on provocation to maintain her position. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, she remained an A-list star, while Hollywood around her shifted and fractured. Then, in 1936, the axis of that power was severed. Irving Thalberg died suddenly at the age of 37. His death was not only a personal loss, it destabilized the structure that had protected Shearer within the studio system. And this is where the story turns. There was no public scandal, no visible collapse, only a quiet decision. After Thalberg's death, Norma Shearer continued acting briefly, but she recognized the changes underway. Hollywood was entering a new era, a different power structure, different expectations, and her value was increasingly framed not by ability, but by age and image. Shearer did not wait to be pushed aside. In 1942, while her reputation and finances were still secure, she chose to retire from filmmaking. No dramatic announcement, no struggle to remain visible. She left while control was still hers. The house that had once functioned as a strategic center of power did not become a site of ruin or tragedy. It became a legacy, a trace of a Hollywood way of working that has largely disappeared. Norma Shearer did not allow Hollywood to define her ending. She chose the moment. She controlled the pace of her exit and preserved her final image on her own terms. In an industry accustomed to exhausting people until they break, a controlled withdrawal becomes a rare form of power. So in a world where fame often ends in enforced silence, what allows a person to leave quietly without losing themselves? The houses are still here, but the dreams have changed owners. All the houses we have walked through still exist in some form. Some are preserved. Some were rebuilt. Some were erased entirely. Yet none of them were ever just buildings. They were witnesses. Witnesses to love that burned too fast, to power that demanded silence, to images carefully constructed and quietly abandoned, to people who arrived believing fame would protect them, and left discovering it could not. Hollywood is not a single dream. It is a chain of dreams, passed from one generation to the next. Each new dream built on the remains of the previous one. And every house we have seen stands at the exact moment when something changed hands. Love into control. Control into image. Image into isolation. Isolation into silence. The price of fame is not always paid in scandal. Sometimes it is paid in rooms that grow too quiet, long before the world stops watching. Not loud, not dramatic, just reflective. Because what lingers is not the headlines, but the spaces left behind. If you could return for a single night and step inside just one of these houses, which one would you choose and why? The stories do not end here. They continue in other places, other rooms, other moments where power shifted quietly and history left its mark. If you want to keep walking through those spaces, the next stories are waiting on your screen. And if this journey stayed with you, feel free to like the video, subscribe for more stories like this, and share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching.